more than
Okay.
that. We should look at some of the previous to see how many have been viewed. It'll be interesting to see.
I can look at that. Well, we're live now, so y'all can go ahead and start.
Good.
We might have a couple people coming in the next little while.
Yes.
And I'll be
Thank
in
you
the
very
hallway
much.
and you can text me.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle.
Okay, so our topic for today is ethical dilemmas.
Right.
And we wanted to explore this in an open discussion kind of way, a give and take. And I'll just begin with some of the things that I've struggled with on this question.
May I let's just
Yes,
introduce.
that's right. So let's just formally do that.
Yeah.
So just introduce yourself again.
Yeah, my name is Song Young Ro in Korean, but I have my English name is Jackie Ro, named after Jackie Chan. I actually working for a Korean government officer, specifically for my Korean presidential protective mission at this moment. So my government sent me here to learn some useful and helpful knowledge and skills about how to solve the conflict in society. So as you see, Korea now has suffered about many kinds of conflict all nationwide. So we need some specialists to know how to the dynamics or mechanism about the conflict at every level, on every level. So that's why I am here. So I just spent 2 semesters. I'm so far so good. I'm so happy. So I want to finish my degree next year.
Oh, you're in the master's program.
Yeah, right.
Oh,
Yeah, right, sir.
Well, this is another reason it's a pleasure to meet you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, and
Nathan Klein. Jackie and I just finished reflective practice, CON 620 together, and enjoyed that time. And I think, as you all know, I'm an active duty Army chaplain. I'm finishing the master's this summer, and will go on to the United States Army Chaplain Center and School to be the professor of world religions, which is a 3-year assignment immediately following the summer semester.
where will that be?
Sorry, that's at Fort Jackson, Columbia, South Carolina.
Wonderful.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
So, Dan Rothbard, and I'm director of a program on ethics and conflict, and also director of the master's program, so it's nice to meet you from that capacity. And also, I've been a philosophy professor for a very long time before my life here. It was kind of a life there. And also, I was a colleague of Mark's years ago. So we have a lot in common. And I'm so happy that Mark suggested this forum for sharing ideas on philosophy and conflict.
So why don't you just launch into some of the subject, and then we can have a discussion. We'll see how long it goes today. By the way, a number of people are stuck on transportation today because the metro is completely closed. And
Is it closed at Roslyn?
it's closed in many places apparently, and nobody can get over to Virginia, and the highways are therefore backed up massively.
Oh, God.
So it took me.
Oh, you were stuck on the highway?
I was stuck on the highways, but I did manage to make it to this.
Oh, that's annoying.
Okay, so just backing up, one of the things that that's fascinated me in the last few years, and Nathan took a course with me in this, is the role of traditional thinking and wisdom literature and philosophy in analyzing the in-depth problems that, in my estimation, are very, very related to the field of conflict analysis and resolution, but the field of conflict analysis and resolution doesn't usually draw on that literature in order to solve those problems or in order to face those kind of issues. So what we proposed to do was have a series of conversations on different topics that we could relate to the subject. And today, just wanted to hone in on the question of ethical dilemmas. And to hone in on it, particularly because ethical dilemmas are actually a very uncomfortable category in general for professional life. So the way in which non-traditional or secular society or civilization, if you will, nobody knows what they mean. Even deconstructing the word secular is problematic. It's more public life in the last few hundred years. Hey, Bill, come on in. Public life in the last few hundred years has attempted to create a kind of social contract of people of great diversity in a public space who have to figure out how to live together. You can call that secular. A lot of these are quasi-secular, quasi-religious, but they all recognize a kind of infinite diversity of people who, on balance, at least in theory, are supposed to be equals. That has changed things because in many societies, you decide ethical questions by a kind of hierarchy of wisdom, a hierarchy of elders and knowledge and determination. Many of our civilizations now are making these decisions equitably as groups, but the groups come from very diverse backgrounds in terms of people with their core values. That's created quite an interesting mix that in many ways causes a lot of the conflicts, even in relatively peaceful societies. So, and this is all by way of saying that professional. Hi, Joe.
How are you, Joe?
Let's stop for a second. This is Bill Johnson, one of my wonderful, brilliant students, and this is Joe Montfield from CRDC, and directing a program here on diplomacy and a 30-year friends. This is Nathan Klein and Jackie.
Are they wonderful too?
Yes, they're wonderful. They're also students and colleagues and friends. So we were in the middle, but we just, we'll just continue.
Please.
So what I was saying was that basically professional ethics, the term professional ethics, is a little bit of a stepchild from ethics. It's basically become a category where we can't agree on big ethical issues, but we can agree on what within our profession would be unprofessional and therefore unethical. So we're not going to make a decision about how our product is affecting people in Timbuktu. That's beyond. That's an ethical question. That's not we're just going to talk about how things go in this building and what's a professional ethical standard and what's not a professional ethical standard. But that's not adequate for the world that we deal with in conflict analysis and resolution, because what we're dealing with is often places of extreme tension and violence, even non-violence, but tension, where there are no standards that are agreed upon, where people are operating with such different ethical principles that they're willing to struggle, undermine each other, fight each other politically, and kill each other occasionally. So in that sphere, conflict analysis and resolution has still tried to create its own professional ethical standards. Although I've never seen a document that makes that explicit in our field, but it's implicit that at least we should have some professional ethics. Where our discussion today is beyond that. It's in the realm of something that's very uncomfortable for professional ethics, and that is ultimately, how do you decide right from wrong when you're in situations of danger to yourself and to others, and where your practices of conflict resolution are not giving you answers to what to do? Because the choices you're facing are quite bewildering, they're overwhelming, and it steps back, in my mind, because I'm trained in philosophy, and because I've been studying philosophy since I was 10, is that for me, it stepped back to the basic questions that Aristotle was asking, that Socrates was asking, that John Stuart Mill was asking, that Kant was asking, etc. And so what I found, and this is where it comes into practice, and then I want to throw it out to everybody, is that what I found is that training in philosophy helped me in very insane situations of conflict where I found myself in great dilemmas. So that, for example, what do you say and don't say in a police state? When people have invited you into the police state at great risk to themselves in order to try to operate in situations that have no precedent, and your field of conflict analysis and resolution is completely unprepared you for that on an intellectual level and on an emotional level and on the level of ethical choices. So, do you tell the truth all the time? Well, you'll get people killed right away if you tell them why you're really there. How much do you lie? You know, how often, and what do you lie about? What is it ethical to lie about in a police state, and what is it not ethical to lie about? How do you make those standards? So, in the history of philosophy, even in the history of philosophy, I have to say, one of the reasons I got into conflict resolution was because the field of ethics in philosophy is a fascinating intellectual exercise, but it's not great on the details. There really isn't a manual that I've ever seen that says, okay, lie here and lie here. Okay, we have utilitarianism, the greatest happiness for the greatest number. And now here's a manual on when exactly lying is the best for the greatest happiness for the greatest number and when it's not. Or, okay, lying might be okay in a police state, but for your character and your virtue, from an Aristotelian point of view, this is what you need to do. I've never seen a manual like that, even in philosophy. So it's not just that this is inadequate in the field of conflict analysis and resolution. The fact is that in the evolution of human thinking, and philosophy is an embodiment of the evolution of human thinking on many issues, on the nature of beauty, the nature of science, the nature of knowledge, the nature of ethics. It never got down to the details of the do's and don'ts and recommendations or even analysis of the different ways of looking at what to do in a police state. How much do you lie? When? How do you create a relationship with somebody and you're never telling them exactly why you're there? What about somebody using you? So many people criticized me. I had been working in Palestine for many years, Palestine and Israel. And many of my Palestinian friends felt that by going up to deal with the Baathists in Syria, I was giving up on Palestine. And not only that, I was providing cover I didn't realize how many of the democratic movements, of Arab citizens in democratic movements across the Arab world would see my working with Baathists, or what they see as me working with Baathists, as a sellout. Because I didn't realize, oh, thank you. I didn't realize how much they resented the Arab regimes. Now it's become more and more obvious, but 15 years ago when I started, it wasn't. So people criticized me for doing that. And then it became clear that the Ba'athist regime was using us for public relations. So we decided that in classic Machiavellian fashion, we know they're using us, we're going to use them better. And so we went with the full knowledge that we would be good public relations, but that we would be using them to create interfaith peace building inside Syria when no one else was ever able to do that before. Now this was that's a fraction of the choices I had to make. And that's why in To Make the Earth Whole, in the book To Make the Earth Whole, half the book is on Syria, and then a huge chunk is on an ethical analysis of the question of ethics and conflict resolution. And where I struggle with the difference between a Kantian principled approach to creating categorical imperatives versus utilitarian calculus versus virtue versus what I sort of came up with, which moved more along the lines of, utilitarianism, and Bentham was very focused on pleasure, the greatest happiness or pleasure for the greatest number. And there's a great deal of debate about what is happiness. Mill tried to make it a little bit more sophisticated than just physical, than just pleasure, right? But they're also a part of a larger field of consequentialism, which is that you evaluate things not by the act itself, but by the consequences of that act. And then you have a principle that you work with. It's not always the greatest happiness. See, Dalai Lama has this, and he does it by the least amount of suffering. for the most amount of people. So suffering, sometimes that's a calculus. I came up with my own consequentialism based on Jewish ethics and my interpretation of them, that was the consequentialism of how to save the most lives. How to save the most lives. What will in the long run save the most lives? And that's why I calculated that building relationships across Syria would ultimately be a far better way to save lives someday than the fact that some Ba'athist leader thinks that I'm putting a good face on Syria. And at the time, part of that calculation was that we had leaders in the White House who wanted to bomb Syria next after Iraq. And we also were determined to not let them do that by showing that we could create civil society in Syria. So there was a part of the calculation of the greatest saving the lives for the greatest number was that we also felt that at that moment in time, there was a great evil adrift in the world, meaning that Iraq first, Syria second, Iran third. You know, this notion of conquering, which turned out to be a massive loss of life and catastrophe in Iraq alone, let alone they didn't even get to Syria at the time. So for various calculations of consequences, I made a consequentialist decision that the work in Syria was valid. And to this day, I stand by that decision. That was a right decision. Many decisions I've made have been mistaken. You know, do I work with settlers who've taken someone else's land, but they're also for peace? How do you evaluate that? They believe in peace. They believe in even in good relationships with Palestinians. They're not haters, and at the same time, they're determined to stay on the only piece of territory that Palestinians were going to build their own state on. What do you do with that? That's an ethical dilemma. But our field at this point has no real guidelines for young and old as to what to do about that. In the end, Aristotle is important here because a lot of the best practitioners among diplomats are people who've developed a certain character approach, which is a kind of virtue of positive relations with everyone, no demonization, listening, respect for everyone, the use of the word. There's many characteristics of the virtuous diplomat, both the citizen diplomat and the official diplomat, that make the world better. And that's what I think Aristotle would argue in these very murky situations, that ultimately it's hard to decide on any situation what's right, but you can build character. And there are diplomats of good character, and there are diplomats of bad character. There are people in conflict resolution of good character. There are people in conflict resolution of bad character. So that in the end, the development of character is one of the best designs for a very murky, confusing world, which is another way to look at all of this. And all of this has interesting parallels and resonance with wisdom literature, with religious literature, because religious traditions have also struggled with all of these things over history. So that's the intro of where my dilemmas are, where my thoughts are on what I'd love to see flourish more in this field.
Okay, that's really very rich, and you're kind of addressing so many tough issues. And one of the challenges here is, can we make, I still believe there's such thing as progress. I mean, we can make progress. I know that's considered, abhorrent in some circles. So, but one of the challenges is what you say, we don't have a professional code, unlike nursing and law and so on. So we're left to the practitioner. Let's talk about the person in the field to kind of, it's too extreme to say make it up as they go along, but it's not unified, clearly. And it's circumstantial. Oftentimes, it's not reflective ahead of time. When people design the peace initiative, it's rare that they'll say, what are our normative commitments, our value commitments in designing this peace initiative, in this intervention. So they make it up. So, and yet, many times they face this. So, as you're suggesting, one view of philosophy in this realm is to start out with principles and try to, people have said, deduce answers to ethical dilemmas or to ethical questions. And dilemma arises when there's a conflict of values, obviously, or corollaries which seem to suggest opposing views. But as Mark, you're suggesting, that really never worked with respect to concrete values, even with utilitarianism, which prides itself, the advocates of utilitarian pride themselves as being on the ground. We're concerned with the details of the circumstance, of the condition of people who are affected by my possible action. Do I do this or do that? We look at the details on the ground. So we deduce it. It doesn't work. In most cases, it works in simple cases that we already know, but not the tough cases. So there's a separation between the theory and the lived experience. Now, the other side, the character side, I agree with many people in the field that say, yeah, but we cannot avoid the normative life of a practitioner. I think we all have we have many kinds of lives. Let me just step back a second. We have our political life as citizens. We have our personal life as family members. We also have a moral life, everybody. So the moral life focuses on the decisions, the emotions, the thought that we think, that we strive towards our conception of the good life or the good. So we do the things that we think will lead to that, and many times we make mistakes, so we feel guilty, or other people tell us we are wrong, or so on. So the professionals need to think about their value commitments, obviously, before they confront the settler or the tyrant or the murderer, before they work with the people who they know or find out later are murderers or complicit with the murderers. The issue of lying, I was just going to talk about that before you mentioned it. I think the issue of lying is a huge issue in our field, versus probably every professional field. That I think we do this a lot. I think we lie a lot, and we rationalize it, partly for the reasons that you're saying. And lying, by the way, when I use that word, it's already a negative. But I think we intentionally tell falsehoods, which that act could be the right act, as you're saying. It could be wrong. But that question's rarely addressed, certainly almost never ahead of time. In advance, the details of designing a workshop often can be really rigorous, never really that. The details of evaluating an intervention should be done always and should be rigorous. Rarely are they addressed about that. But we withhold the truth all the time. And we probably, the people who are really good at it have an internal barometer, and they just know. And I think it's what Wallace Warfield would say is part of reflective practice. It's just intuitive. Highly professional people know when to withhold the truth or when not to withhold the truth. But what's lacking is a public conversation about that, lacking among the professionals. And that's a shame. I don't have a clear answer on this, but I do think another issue also I was going to talk about, you mentioned, are we advocates or are we neutral facilitators? Well, sometimes we're neutral facilitators. Sometimes what I find interesting is that some people are doing the same thing in the same intervention. They're both facilitators sometimes and advocates for the marginalized at the same time, but they're not being honest to themselves and sometimes not honest to the participants. And that is, again, I think we should talk about this. So I think I totally agree. The character approach is absolutely critical to who we are as professionals, as it is in every rigorous profession I can think of. And what is particularly striking is we learn it by the failed cases, which is unfortunate, but I think that's just a matter of life. You know, we know in Virginia now the standards for ethics among the politicians have become crystallized because of the McDonald, disaster. And they become more a part of conversation, public conversation. Rarely is it a conversation without a negative. So there's something about focusing on the negatives, but I don't think we should just focus on the negatives. In other words, there's a tendency for us, it's almost human nature for some reason. I know that's simplistic, but there's such a tendency to gravitate towards the immorality of a profession, the failed, the immoral cases, which then might spur on clarification of what our standards should be. But I think we should work at doing both. So I have always thought we should have professional standards, but I know politically in the profession there's a lot of resistance to this and highly controversial. But I've always thought of this. And I always thought we should look to nursing. Nursing is at the forefront of the attention to the value commitments of their profession. The contrast with medicine is striking, and medicine is just slowly caught up as a result of lawsuits in some controversial cases in the 1970s and 80s and patients' rights movements. But we should do that. So,
I noticed that I got a chance when my sister was very sick to basically live inside an intensive care unit for 3 months in Boston, and it was one of the best of the world. Mm-hmm. And what was remarkable to me was how different it was from 15 years before, mm-hmm. when my father was very sick in intensive care units, and it all revolved around the new relationship between nurses and doctors.
Oh, is that right?
And it's the result of all those lawsuits, is that nurses had much, much more power on a moment-to-moment basis. If they were talking to a doctor, the doctor was in charge, but that nurse went right away to the patient, and the nurse was the one making the decisions at every moment and because many people died waiting for a doctor to say yes or no about something when the nurse knew exactly what to do. So it was interesting to see that sometimes crises lead to a deepening of an understanding of the ethics of the field.
Right.
Snowden has gone from being a villain to possibly being a hero of American and even contemporary, freedom. And if they're making a statue. There's a statue of him in Germany. That's remarkable. We're watching something happen that's really interesting in that regard. All the teachers who cheated in Virginia mm-hmm. on those exams, well, it turns out it's not so simple because there is a national rebellion against hyper-testing. Mm-hmm. And they're only at the forefront of a scheme that's opened up this whole question of what do you do as teachers and students when there's a national standard that's intolerable? And how can you react? So we're not the only field. The reason why I think professional standards may be hard is that with all of the complexity of a nursing situation, the variables are not nearly as great as being dumped in Kabul mm-hmm. or dumped into the middle of a conflict zone where you don't know anything and you don't know anyone. We have it's much more. The variables are infinite
and they're unknown. They're unknown.
They're unknown. How do you create that professional? Which I think that Aristotle understood about a lot of life's infinities, and therefore he focused on character and virtue. Some people are dissatisfied with Aristotle because he's not really facing the dilemmas. He just wants to create character, but maybe that part of that was that in the end we don't know. The genius of the human mind is its infinite flexibility in situations that are unpredictable. And so focusing on character is hardwiring the brain to the good.
Yeah.
Without knowing what that good is going to be and what that bad is going to be in any number of situations. I can't begin to describe the kind of calculations that are going on in my mind. And looking back and realizing my own flaws when I examine, like I did, this is what reflective practice. See, I think reflective practice can feed right into this nicely.
Absolutely.
Because I did a reflective practice with my research class, ironically, about my behavior in Turkey with my own class, because I just talked about lying. Another big one is distributive attention and justice. Like if Mason is paying me to take a class, to teach a class, but the nature of the class is to nurture and help and service people in trouble, refugees, activists, people who are suffering. Who do I have a greater moral obligation to? The people who paid for the class, or the people that we're visiting? The people who paid for the class are privileged, they're safe, they're not in any danger, and when they are nervous about danger, maybe they're being a little bit infantile. Because they're not really. The people we're with, they're going back and forth into enormous danger. They don't know where the next day's bread is going to come from. And, where is my greater moral obligation?
This is the refugee camp in Turkey?
It happens all the time. Every trip of conflict resolution service that I've been doing for years and years involves the teacher or the practitioners in a dilemma as to where your greater obligation is, to your students or to the people that you're there to serve. The school will for sure say it's only the students.
Right.
What are you even thinking about?
Right.
So maybe we'll say 80-10, 80-20. Maybe we'll say 50-50. Maybe some people will be so moved by what they're seeing, they'll say, these students, that's the whole point. This is their basic training. I'm not going to coddle them. They should know better. They should watch me and shut up. That could also be an instinct. And that's a dilemma that any honest practitioner, as a teacher or a scholar practitioner, teacher practitioner, faces in the field. So, these are, what do you do with that? Is that character? Is that utilitarianism? Is it Kantian?
I would
make those kind of decisions.
To make it more complicated, I would throw in moral emotions also. You have compassion, you have a sense of obligation to your students, or even affection to your students. There's they're wonderful people. That's an advance.
Or what if I have too much affection for the victims? That clouds my professional responsibility as a teacher.
Right.
Like what if I feel so awful for the victims. And so what do emotions do for you? Are emotions a good guide to ethics, or are they a bad guide to ethics?
Well, I think it's part of your character approach. Yeah. There's definitely, and that's an advance over our.
So we can go on and on. This all started by us wanting to have conversations together on philosophy. But then we decided, we want everybody to involve. So we could go on forever. But now we want to open it up to your thoughts on everything that's been raised, your experiences, and we'll continue the conversation. So who would like to begin?
If you don't mind, can I talk first?
Yeah.
Sure. Sorry for my poor English. I also tried to figure out what is the main root cause about the conflict analysis. So far, I got developed my own draft about the kind of theory and how the conflict happens and how it de-escalate, how it be resolved. In my point of view, I got some kind of balance theory at this moment. Balance theory. Yeah, in terms of philosophical point of view and ecological and aesthetic, even sociological point of view. I think the balance is a very important factor in terms of the conflict. Because You already told about the ethical dilemma in terms of the personal, I mean the universal is ethics versus the professional ethics as a practitioners. As a practitioner, we usually work in the context of the conflict or violence. It is quite different from the normal context where we live in. So we need some kind of very different approach about to the conflict analysis and resolution. So in this case, we need some kind of the balance about how to approach to conflict beyond neutrality, because neutrality sounds very good and very well balanced, but it's very difficult for us to technically to adjust some neutrality in practice. But balance theory is kind of some very prudent activity or kind of perception. Whenever we need some very some case which is unbalanced situation, we can artificially or prudently make some balance between marginalized people or the privileged people. Well, then we can make some balance between them. Then they can have some kind of the horizontal point of view, or I think their perception. In that case, we can have a talk between all parties. Because I think that is our job, to make balance among all parties. If there happens some unbalanced situation, there is no, I think, justice or equality. For example, I'd like to take some example about democracy in Middle East or weak states. For them, the democracy is kind of, they feel it kind of the threat to their survival or security. If they adopt the security, they might be dead or might be kind of in such a dangerous cases situation, because their political situation is not so, I think, very stabilized. But in terms of the donors or the international interventioners, democracy is kind of fake. Their belief or faith, democracy is good for every person. They have their own perception about democracy, but the other party, the political elite in Middle East, they don't perceive the democracy as their faith or belief. They just consider it threat their life or survival. So there happens some mismatching about the same phenomenon, democracy. So we need to equalize the perception gap. That is kind of the balance theory.
Balance is to equalize the perception.
Yeah, about the same thing.
Democracy.
Yeah, right. Okay. So far I got some value hierarchy. I now developing some kind of the value hierarchy. The lower grade is interest, tangible or intangible, or resources or kind of pleasure or delightment, something like that. It's kind of interest. But much higher level, I think, is belief or faith, such as democracy or justice or equality. But the higher level is just imminent security or survival. So we need to find out what is the real cause about the violence or conflict, because we are now just looking at the symptom, their collective angers or some violent activities. They can be might be used as functions or some instrument for acquiring what they want.
So if you were to, you're suggesting that a kind of an essential ethical principle of intervention would be the equalization or balance of perceptions.
Yeah, right.
That would be the most ethical thing you can do in any situation of conflict.
Yeah.
Is to equalize perceptions.
Yeah, right.
To make perceptions clear to each party of what the
even
other.
We can make some conditions to be equalized, to be balanced. As you told me in the previous class, you told me about some kind of incremental positive change. So we need some strategy as a practitioner because we don't act in normal situation. We just act in conflict and violence situation. So we are now situated on very different, I think, environment. So we need to have our own ethical code or issue or standard. So that means, so we need to find out that point. So I think we need some kind of sense of balance.
It's interesting because perspective taking
Yeah.
and empathy are one of the research on the psychology research is that empathy, perspective taking is one of the key ingredients of violence reduction or nonviolence.
Right.
So you could almost say that you're positing an ethical act. I mean, I don't want to agree to the professional standards approach, but this, if you could we could start collecting what people think is the most essential missing principle.
Yeah.
And so Jackie's would be, the missing principle would be, always act in such a way as to help equalize perceptions.
Yeah, right.
That's
And
it.
equalize puts a burden on the participants for understanding of the other.
Yes.
Yeah, right.
Yes.
So it's a normative.
Right. Basic
It becomes
normative thing.
part of, so the facilitator sets up something and establishes an expectation of the participants. I mean, it's so much more than the directed conversation that Burton was talking about. This is now an obligation. You are obligated to understand and somewhat maybe empathize. I'm not
And
sure.
this is what we found in the field was the most revolutionary.
Yeah.
Was the role playing, perspective taking is the most, it looks like kindergarten, and it is the most difficult psychological thing for people to actually practice. And one of the things that creates the most immediate changes sometimes.
So can I tell you something interesting? Based upon the value hierarchy from interest to some kind of security or survival issue, some people perceive a certain phenomena as interest, but the other people feels it is related to their survival. For example, in our country, when we were before the Japanese colonization in 1910 or 20 at the beginning of 20th centuries, we were suffering, transitioning from the traditional society to the civilized country. So our government adopted some civilized standards, such as hair cutting, because when traditional society, we raised our hairs without cutting, because we have some kind of faith that as a descendants of our ancestors, we should preserve our all bodies with our hairs, even nails, something like that. We don't cut. But as the civilization comes in, we should have cut our hairs. It seems a little bit related to interest for civilization. But some ancestors considered it was kind of a threat, survival. Because it is related to their identity.
Right.
We should keep it, preserve our body without cutting. So they even suicide themselves. Oh, quite very, exciting, very, disaster. So we need to, normalize the value hierarchies, because every person has their own perception about the value hierarchy. So in terms of the going upward with the same common sense, we can go outside. That is called extremism in this case. But vice versa, some person consider it is related to belief or faith, but the other person want to consider it as just an interest. Especially it is related to financial or money factor. In that case, we can call them as the materialism, something like that.
Fascinating.
Right. Yeah. So I'm now trying to
see the case study is so deep when you go.
And the terminology that it's very important that you use the words of the person who believes it.
Mhm.
In other words, there's a tendency of the other person to translate,
Yeah, right.
or which is can be a form of denigrating.
Based on his background, knowledge,
Yeah.
history, culture, something like that.
See, we always felt that that John Burton was in some ways derivative. He was very creative in many ways, but his hierarchy of needs was derivative from Maslow.
Mhm.
And Maslow's hierarchy was very culture-based and had a lot of assumptions to it that we've kind of questioned. And I would push back and say that if somebody considers their fingernails and their hair a matter of their own identity and survival, and it's just them, that's a different ethical question than whether they want to impose it on everyone else. In other words, the difference between violence and nonviolence is, do I want to never cut my fingernails just because the Japanese or Western civilization told me to, or do I want to make sure that no one cuts their nails? That is the difference between extremism or ultra-violence versus personal choice. And personal choice is very much a human rights category. But imposition, we tend to label as extremist. So there's a lot of good ways that philosophers should be working together with basic human needs.
Absolutely.
To say, hey, wait a second, we can't make assumptions here. If people are going to start committing suicide over this, we have to rethink what really is the right intervention. But if they start killing over it, it's different. Then it becomes a question of law and order, the violation of rights of others, etc. And I realize that I'm still using the human rights language, which is
Well,
it's a pretty modern conception
and universalist.
and imposing. But I think that our field favors less violence. There is a professional standard. We are in favor of less violence.
Well, that might be that's in the realm I see of ultimate goal, the good state. There's a minimal aspect of the good state, which is negative peace.
Right.
And then there's, of course, positive peace. So
but they're operative in how would we work with Jackie's community in 1910?
Right.
And knowing that that's our ultimate goal. You see, it's
so the balance.
The
balance framing is very suggestive, and in any conflict, I think we would agree. There's so many areas where balance is needed. That is among any group of people. It's not one. It's not just teetering on one issue, security or whatever, and
balance was central to Aristotelian thinking. It was central to
that's very
Taoist
Aristotelian.
thinking,
you know that
Confucian thinking.
Aristotle. Prudence is the medium between that. So you're in a great tradition.
Western and Eastern traditions have a lot of focus on balance.
Right.
An initial hesitation I have, Jackie, with the word balance, I don't think with the spirit of what you're conveying, is that it, as I hear it, it implies a certain compromise between two parties, which may not be necessary, although I can see that often a level of compromise is required. What Professor Rothbard said, he said translate. That's a word that I think, without giving it a whole lot more thought, works as well, and you might want to consider, because translation, and this is something that I'm giving a lot of thought to within the hermeneutical tradition, the philosophy of how words not just convey our thoughts, but construct our realities. It seems to me that as two people attempt to understand one another, I don't have to compromise my position or my values in order to attempt to understand your position such that, and this is the standard, that when I articulate what it is I'm hearing you say is your concern, you need to recognize yourself in that description. If you say, yes, Nathan, that is my position, then while I may have balanced, I haven't conceded or compromised anything of inherent value that is at at the root of whatever conflict we might be experiencing between one another.
I understand. Yeah, what you said. So we have many kind of powers, from coercive power or very, I think, very referential powers. So it can be adapted, I think, strategically.
But ironically, one of the things that might be at work here is English to Korean itself, because this notion of balance, whether it's the, in Taoist or other, you might be thinking of balance in a very different non-materialistic sense that I might be hearing that word. I think of balancing numbers on a spreadsheet very much in a utilitarian way, and you might be thinking of the Taoist, the yin and the yang sort of balance in nature. And so it deserves a fleshing out in a conversation.
Yeah, it would have to be defined and constructed.
Yeah.
Because, I think of this very intuitive, nuanced ability that many parents have when they communicate to their children across the stages of human development. They might have a teenager like we do at home, 16 and a 9 and a 5-year-old. And I would answer the same question 3 different ways based on where they are. And I'm not lying. I am packaging the information that I believe is best suited for where they are. Granted, this is a vertical structure and one that I think is problematic within a conflict.
Right, but when all 3 of them want to do something different on the Sunday afternoon and all 3 of them want to do it with you, then you're going to be back to Jackie's question of balance. Because if you agree on that day to do just what one of them wants, you're damn sure that they're going to hold you to that the other Sundays are going to be for the other kids.
Right.
So balance is very fundamental, and especially in a lot of deep places of conflict. I was just listening on C-SPAN to a Sunni presentation at Brookings that was very, very interesting, of Sunni governors in Iraq and what's going wrong and fighting ISIS on the one side, and everything in the Sunni-Shia relationship cries out for methodologies of balance, and it's not forthcoming. It's amazing to me how much we should be in a world of emergency over Sunni-Shia relations, considering the last 30, 40 years, and we're actually in a situation of silence and complicity in Sunni-Shia warfare, with the superpowers taking sides on both sides and aiding and abetting a perpetual state of war between Sunni and Shia. And what it cries out for in every country is balance. That's what they're claiming. You said, where's the balance between Sunni and Shia in the army? Where is the balance in the implementation of the de-Baathification? But everything is about balance, and they're saying that. So I think it's a very, and we hear this all the time in terms of anybody who's involved with inveterate enemies, and you're sitting in between them.
Yeah.
I sometimes on Facebook, I have to literally list all the other things I would also say, just so that people don't fly off the handle with one thing I said that could be perceived as out of balance. Mm-hmm. That I was only criticizing one country, and that I was only singling them out. Mm-hmm. It's an interesting standard. But we want to hear from other folks.
Any other topic?
Who might want to share some of their reactions to the subject of the day of ethical dilemmas.
No, I have no comments, but I think that students should have the first dibs.
Oh, okay.
You can go ahead first, and I'll
You want to sit in the back there? One of the thoughts came to my mind when Mark was talking about Aristotle and the issue of character, and how it can be manifest in official diplomacy and unofficial diplomacy. I have had only a smattering of immersion in the great philosophical traditions. Actually, I have it more in Eastern or Middle Eastern philosophy. And I share Mark's orientation, which I know you also share, which is our job is to save as many lives as possible. Not a very complex, and I couldn't write a book about it. But it's a driving instinct. I want to mention that I just finished reading a long novel by Graham Fuller, who was at one point deputy chief of the National Intelligence Council. He's a CIA operations officer. He was station chief in Kabul. And we studied intensive Arabic together in Beirut for a long time. And advertising his novel, which he self-published, it's called Breaking Faith. He said, there are sometimes that only a novel gives you the freedom to say what you really think. And it's extremely well written, it's a page turner, and it's absolutely devastating about our moronic policy towards the Arab and Muslim world and the devastation we've imposed. The visiting specialists from the Pentagon and state or CIA who come in with the latest great idea about how to beat Muslim extremism and how idiotic they all are. So that's one way of dealing with the issue of democracy. They all talk about democracy and promoting democracy. And meanwhile, they're bombing the shit out of Muslims. The funeral procession, the wedding party, we bombed with drones. It's all in the book. It's fascinating. But it's very interesting to how the guy he's really brilliant. He's polylingual and he's living in British Columbia now. And I kept thinking, he could have gotten so sick of the profession he was in. As he would recruit agents and be a political reporter, but he just wanted to move to a cleaner country. I'm going to ask him for confess. On the question of deception, sometimes another way of saying lying. I was Near East Division Chief in the Bureau of Intelligence Research in the State Department. Early in the Reagan administration, it was quite clear from the transition team preparing, and this was the team that threw Hal Saunders, Assistant Secretary of State, out of his office, said, we don't want your kind around here. I happen to be very engaged in a campaign to name this school for Hal Saunders, but I just have to raise $25 million first. I was, in my position, I was a member of the sort of Interagency Intelligence Council, and I somehow maneuvered myself into being the editor of a special national intelligence estimate on Libya. The neocons would have bombed Libya even before Reagan was inaugurated. That's how eager they were. And I did a lot of work on this intelligence analysis and made it so complicated on the origins of Gaddafi in Mauritania and how his people moved across the north of the Sahara Desert, but across the Sahara, and a very complex arms relationship with Russia and so on. I made it so complicated that it took a year before they could actually get a consensus up to bombing Gaddafi. They still did. I just wanted to delay it. We're talking about ethical challenges and this work now.
Absolutely.
I was working as a...
You were a obstructionist.
Yeah.
But you did it with an ethical principle.
Absolutely.
Which was delaying the killing as long as possible.
Yeah. And see, that's why I thought the point you made about Palestinians criticizing you for going to talk, to work with the Ba'athis in Syria. You have to get people into positions so that they can make a contribution at some point when other factors are equal or positive, so that they're ready to save more lives. That's what you were doing. You were building relationships. It looked to people who were seized with the emotion of their own needs, their own sense of injustice, and in a way they're like children whose parent has left them to go to talk to some other children. But that's also one way of making an ethical judgment. And as I said, I share the basic values. I have very Jewish values now. In fact, my second daughter is pregnant with a half Jewish embryo. I'm very pleased about that. And Aristotle as you were describing the philosophers about whom I have to confess a great deal of ignorance, I was reminded of the bourgeois gentilhomme, Molière, character who discovers he's been speaking prose all of his life. So I discovered I'm an Aristotelian more than I ever knew. Here's another example of trying to pre-position people to transition to a more creative value system that could result in saving lives. I chaired a panel at the Political Psychology annual meeting in Herzliya, interdisciplinary center. And I had consulted with Alec Isaacs. You may know him.
I know Alec.
Yeah. We've become very close. He's a.
Who is he?
He is a very observant, modern Orthodox. He's been teaching at Hebrew University. Now he's working at Bar Ilan on conflict resolution, and he's been reading my stuff. And he's a very ethical person.
He's a scholar, and he's also an activist in connecting
Yeah.
modern Orthodox Jews and Muslims.
Yeah.
And
he's
for
particularly
deeper global
interested
dialogue.
in working with settler rabbis.
Yeah.
Because he doesn't put it as crudely or simply as I do, but he's trying to persuade them that God's command for peace has as much weight, if not more, than God's implied or assumed command to reclaim the land of Israel. And in this case, it's rather poignant. He recommended two people that he'd been working with. One was the chief rabbi, or the rabbi, of the Gush Katif settlement. That was.
This is online?
Huh?
This is on YouTube.
Uh-huh.
Our conversation.
Okay. Well, I won't.
So let's not mention names of the people that he's.
All right. Well, I forgot.
No, it's okay. Just know those names.
But it's a good example of. I should have been suspicious that there are two goddamn screens up there.
It's okay.
At least you're not secretive. Now, the panel, there are two people that Alec had recommended, and he said they're beautiful. And I think he's beautiful, so if he said they're beautiful, I accept it. The other one was Mohammed Dajani, the Palestinian. And the rabbi only spoke Hebrew, and I think that was all. And his partner in program, called Siach Shalom's Talking Peace, was a secular woman from Sapir College, a very liberal college in the south of Israel. They're both extremely devoted to each other. He had been in great pain because the expulsion of these Gaza settlers was very, very painful for them. But in his presentation, which she was translating, he said, it was very painful for us, but we have to think that in imposing settlements, we're causing pain for others of God's children, meaning the Palestinians. And we have to figure out what is God's guidance in this? He was giving an ethical dilemma as a settler rabbi. I was just so moved by that expression and you couldn't get it unless you're willing to sit down with him and listen to him present. And so what the Siach Shalom project is doing is trying to develop among settler rabbis the sense of the ethical requirements of what being Jewish means.
Very nice.
But I just want to make this one final point. I have a real bias in this work. I believe that anybody who presumes to be a facilitator in a dialogue, an organizing dialogue, should know the politics and history extremely well. If you don't know that, then the people you're trying to whose discussion you're trying to facilitate won't really respect you. They'll spot your ignorance very shortly, and you lose points. Big time.
Another professional principle.
Yeah. Also, I have a strong bias towards developmental psychology and psychological needs. I once reduced it in a talk I was giving in Ireland, called the Iron Laws of Human Nature. Very presumptuous, but it just came to me. I keep referring to the angel Gabriel every time I sound really presumptuous. Every human being, every individual, tribe, and nation craves recognition, acceptance, and respect. And I think that's universal. I mean, that's a human rights foundation. Very, very simple. And people who are taking notes can write it down very quickly, and maybe they'll remember it. But understanding human psychology, I'm afraid that a lot of people who for decades have gotten into the mediation, negotiation, facilitation game really haven't understood basic human needs. And that's what Burton did. I mean, he and Maslow's, I think Maslow's hierarchy of human needs is not culturally specific. I think really in terms of developmental psychology in Asia and Africa and elsewhere, Latin America, that reflects, first of all, the basic need for security and survival and safety is the most fundamental in every tribe you go to and nation. And the idea of what is perhaps culturally reflective of the success of certain Western civilizations through wealth creation to give opportunities for development that many societies don't have. But fulfillment of one's developmental potential, building a sense of self that feels fulfilled, at least has a chance for fulfillment, is one of more, and I think this would be attractive in any culture, regardless of how long the hair is and the fingernails. I think, especially when you think in terms of parents and what they would like to see their children have an opportunity to aspire to. So that's just free associating.
That's great.
That's very good.
So I want to get into some of the other people.
Yeah, I do too. Let me just quick response, if you don't mind, Bill. I think your advocacy for more and deeper psychological understanding is just right on, and we, that somehow that should be much more of a normal part of the training, and it's not, and yet in a way, so you're really putting more demands on facilitators. So plus they should know more. So let me just tell you an experience that I had about the very important point. The facilitator should be virtually an expert. We had workshops for Darfurians, and we said, well, we can do all our reading, we can do all of our background, but we'll never know the details, the cultural, the site. You'll never know the culture. And the culture, of course, is inseparable from the social psychology. It can come in to play in such mundane aspects of the food, obviously, or the status of the participants to each other. But it also demands a much deeper understanding of the nuances of words, the inflection, the emotion when someone says something to the participants themselves. So frankly, I gave it up, and we had an expert on our team who was among them. In other words, we got a Darfurian on our team. And I think that worked pretty well. And we put him in a position, very, very important role in the dialogue. And I think that worked well. And then we also quickly realized that the participants who were the militants, about half of them were militants, and still are militants at the time. And in fact, later they continued their militancy. So we didn't quite have a great success. But they're experts. They are the experts in the conflict. So that suggests another, I think, gross mistake in our field that we are the experts, we are rational, you know, that whole division of professional.
That's an elicitive move. You made an elicitive move.
Yeah.
And I do that always,
Yeah.
is that, you know, I'm not the government. I don't have to worry about being responsible to be the official negotiator or official facilitator. If I give over everything to Syrians and they become my eyes and ears and I listen to them, of course I'm filtering. Of course I'm making my own decisions and I push back sometimes. But basically, the elicitive method is suggesting that the level of enormous cultural ignorance is so vast that it's best to identify serious partners that you can trust with that process of being the eyes and ears and knowing the situation. But
that's hard.
That also, are you evaluating that person based on, I mean, I go back to Aristotle. I look for character. I actually look for, you know, who among the thousands do you trust on that? And I start looking for issues of character and partnerships as well.
One footnote to what you're saying, Dan. In the early stages of the assault of the conflict resolvers on Northern Ireland, there were anecdotes coming out that there were so many flying into Belfast looking for people to facilitate, that once the representatives of the groups in conflict who had done it in the past heard that they had been in town, they just left town. They just went underground because they didn't want to deal with other untrained, unsophisticated, unpsychologically sensitive, and deeply ignorant about Irish, English,
I think
Scottish
what Joe is a matter of levels and levels. What Joe is suggesting is don't fly in talking about democracy without any knowledge or care, so that even study for a day, even a 10-page paper that distills some basic understanding would be better than a lot of what actually goes on. Yeah. So it's a matter of, it's all relative, you know, as well. But I want to get in Bill here before we run out of time.
Sure, thanks. So I just had a comment in response to the ethical dilemmas in these class trips or in these conflict interventions. And I hope this isn't oversimplified, but I think the most important factor when you're making these decisions, so I mean, because I experienced a couple of those situations where you had to decide between students, university, or the people we're helping. And when you're making these decisions in volatile conflict environments, I think that the greatest or the net potential reduction of pain and suffering for all parties involved. So again, you don't really have to, as you mentioned, worry about the students so much because they're relatively safe. And university, obviously you need to respect university policies and make sure the students aren't at risk, but I think decisions should be made based on, again, like the net potential reduction of the pain and suffering, almost from the Buddhist lens, you know?
Yeah.
And of course, calculation can be flawed, so I wouldn't trust that decision to be made from one of the students, I mean, or someone who didn't have any experience working in that conflict environment. But as long as the person is virtuous, as long as they're well educated and informed about the conflict environment, I think that they should have that ability to make that calculation and make that decision. And again, as long as students are safe, but the whole purpose of the intervention or the trip is for that reflective practice and to give students that experience and help and use the energy of the students to not only learn but help the group of people that you're there to help. And I think that's like back to, you know, that's how you should decide on which party or which, you know, university students or the parties you're helping, how you make that decision. And then I actually had a question. When you're making these ethical decisions, is it okay to lie or bend the truth to the students by saying maybe telling them that there's nothing to worry about, even though there might be a little sliver of something to worry about? Like, do you think it's okay to stretch the truth if you know that there's really nothing to be concerned about, but by giving them a blanket, it's okay, don't worry about anything?
Yeah, I mean, these are all good questions, and I've learned a lot in the last year. On balance, because classes have such a variety of people in them with such a difference in capacity, to cope with difficult situations. You never quite know. You never quite know how people are going to react. So that, for example, the Turkey situation was a lot more fast-paced, and there were a lot more different opinions on the ground. Whereas when I used to go into Syria, into Ba'ath Syria, and I would tell the students what to say and what not to say. So, okay, you either go on a trip and you invite students or you don't. And we did interviews to say, can they cope with such a situation where they have to watch every word? Because every class was bugged, every room was bugged, and we told them not to have conversations in private that were, talking about Assad, for example, or talking about anything like that. Okay, so I could conceivably say, there's probably one of those students who can't cope with the pressure. So maybe I should cancel the whole trip. So these are all ethical calculations,
Right.
and even professional calculations. And then there's the unpredictability of things changing on the ground that you didn't expect when you went in the first place. So then how do you cope with the fact that, say, half the class wants this, half the class wants that, they all don't have as much information as you do, they don't have as much experience as you do. How do you make those kind of decisions? So, and then of course you're also a professional and you have a university and you have to worry about that too. And that's a self-interest. Really, it was my self-interest calculations are different than my ethical calculations. In the end of the day, my research class helped me to understand reflectively one flaw in my whole calculation. And that is that I tend to look at Westerners as having my back. That's the way we literally looked at border situation, where it was a 180-degree angle to soldiers and victims and all of those, and then a class behind me.
Mm-hmm.
And the class behind me is the other 180 degrees, and that 180 degrees, they're my back. They're mature. They're here because they understand the situation. They're safe. They have my back. But what I realized is they don't have my back. Is that if you're going to be a mentor and you're going to bring people into a mess, then you have to have a 360-degree lens. It doesn't matter that you can't come with an assumption they should know better. You have to just accept that in a situation of conflict, everybody is having their own reactions. And you just have to go in with a much more solid sense of self as mentor and teacher. And that was a learning for me that is gonna influence my ethical engagement with everybody in the field from now on. To not make assumptions almost as if I need a back, I need parents, I need support group, I need a support group. Our whole field is another unprofessional thing about our field is that we have no training or commitment to psychological issues of healing, trauma, coping with trauma, understanding how hard practice really is. And a number of the students on this trip were quite upset about that and said that I wasn't prepared for the emotions I was going to have. I was depressed for 3 weeks afterwards, and they're right. Our field is nowhere near social work at this point, because our field was founded by highly intellectual men who were focused on elite negotiations. And a lot of those elite negotiations were messed up because those men did not recognize their own psychological issues. So we do need to evolve not only better knowledge before we go, better knowledge of psychology, but really better knowledge of our own psychology, which is what Wallace and Sandy and others were trying to institute.
Andrea.
But we literally need to, this is emerging as maybe some recommendations that you and I should think about.
I think we should. Definitely.
Just at least provoking this, because that's how these new fields develop, is by these kind of discussions.
Yeah.
So these are great insights.
This is really very valuable.
Great insight.
Actually, in the few minutes that we have left, let's throw out something. And I'm going to start. What would you like to see in the context of our discussions? I know you've been very busy. We had discussions on words, power of word, language, on different notions of causality. We had human rights issue, universality versus relative, and so on. And what else did we have? I think that was, I think we had one more. I know, I remember. Let's see, I had to jot down. It's been a long, emotions.
Right.
Fantastic topic, which I think, the whole issue of ethics, for philosophers looking at ethics, they've been separating out the emotion in most cases, except pragmatists maybe not. But anyway, I would like to see, let's go around, one recommendation or many. I would like to see questions of value commitment in the design. We do, our classes, as you all know, we do a lot of work on design and preparation. And then we also do a lot of work on evaluation, different models and so on. I'd like to see value clarification in both as a major question. And not just values like peace and love, but value, what is the value, how are you valuing, what are the value commitments that you have towards the participants, first towards actually the community that you're seeking to, overcome disaster, and value commitments to the participants with issues of lying and so on. So I'd like to see that. And then in the same respect, evaluation. How'd you do? How'd it work out? Did you keep your were you able to? Or recognizing, as you were saying, the circumstances are such a high degree of unpredictability, even in dialogue sessions, recognizing that as well. Anyway, so that's my recommendation.
Which I'd like to hear from others that I've talked to now.
So I'd be, if you don't mind.
Sure.
I'd be interested in discussion on the ethics of psychological or psychosocial treatment for conflict-affected people, and how you get away from the Western style of treatment or the Western lens of treatment that might not work, or probably doesn't work widespread for every single culture around the world, and how you, I don't know if you consult anthropologists or what, but how you develop an effective regime.
Very good.
And Bill just wrote a great paper on beginning to provoke that discussion. But that's great.
Right.
And it touches on when, maybe next year if we start again, we should talk about universalism versus non-universalism in our field, in the sense that there's such a deep commitment we have to issues, universal notions like human rights as a basis of our field.
And needs.
Deep commitment to understanding psychology on a universal level. Many of those people were trying to understand what's wrong with us as human beings, what's right with us as human beings, and you have to try to grapple with universal. And yet, we've been made humble by the anthropologists and by the understanders of culture that we make huge mistakes when we just go in without that lens. So that in one culture, I didn't know until I had thousands of students that laughing in some cultures is actually crying, is actually a symbol of nervousness. I thought, do you know what the implications of that are in terms of diagnosing a situation, in terms of misunderstanding how people are reacting to horror and trauma? So, just that's one tiny example. So I think that it's very wise, but we have to ask, again, the philosophical question, universals versus particulars.
I think that question
would be a nice
permeates
topic.
all through our field, and is the silent struggle.
Yeah.
And it came, with human rights, with needs, with burden, and so on. But there's a whole bunch of psychology that's very contextual, that wants to undermine the universality of needs. Very, the contextual approach to violence.
Well, some of us as practitioners too, this is one of the only, I think in 20 years of knowing each other, it's probably one of the only principled places where I respectfully disagree, because my understanding of the person who commits suicide over hair and nails is very similar to my analysis of the fact that for an Orthodox Jew, like my grandmother, she was willing to let the family starve if she had to work on Saturday. So it totally screws up Maslow's hierarchy for her on that day. And then I would always tell my class that on Monday, she went right back to being Maslow.
Mhm.
So on Saturday, she wasn't Maslow. On Monday, she was Maslow. So that, that whole notion of the contextual priorities that some people have, and how much do you indulge that?
Yeah.
So if the settler is dying because he was taken out of his settlement, and then you're looking at 10 million Palestinians who were
Right.
taken out versus him needing even Gaza, then where does the ethics call you in terms of indulging his pain?
Mhm.
So that's something I think you should. I think a good therapist does do that, but how do you balance it?
Yeah.
Coming back to balance, how do you indulge in
Let
all
me
of
just
that?
do a quick comment on it. What that strategy in dealing with these settler activists is trying to get them to transition their mode of thinking for very direct political interests, so that the militancy, which is very, very intense in a small but very, very dangerous segment of the society, that they'd lose their constituency. So this is a long-term strategic approach for an immensely complex
Right.
psychosocial political
Right.
issue. So we need a capacity for long-term strategic thinking that's very political and psychologically informed.
That's right.
And that's why I was embracing him. And that's why the secular sociologists from Sevier College, who had nothing to do with his ideology, but loved the fact that he had the capacity to empathize with the Palestinians. And that's a big breakthrough.
That's something you want to encourage.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
so that's the point. You have to be able to settle for short-term gains.
Yeah.
And this is a very presumptuous profession we're in. And the fact that we haven't been able to define it is really.
Your example is really kind of riveting about your very virtuous obstruction of the bombing.
Yeah.
I mean, that was a gain.
Yeah.
And you might say very limited, but it was the best under those circumstances.
Exactly.
I call them increments. Incremental ethics, and that's the best you can do in many situations.
Exactly.
All you can do is an increment.
Exactly.
Which is why conflict analysis is a field. It's fine to analyze why the structures are impossible, but in the end of the day, if you don't deal with increments, you're not dealing with anything. You're throwing up your hands and saying, well, we can't do anything. The structure, and very often you want to. I mean, I've come to some very problematic conclusions about the Arab world as long as oil is in the hands of a very, very few. It's a really problematic structural situation. And at the same time, how can we not act? How can we not think of?
Exactly.
Right.
You have to keep it.
Let's hear. What else? What would you like to see? Recommendation here. I'm asking if we can some result of our conversations here.
So on the other side of the conflict, coming back to the perspective of the practitioner as reflective in practice, it's been my observation. I mean, the conversation that's taken place here is based on one of an understanding of philosophy, primarily an understanding of philosophy that does not occur that isn't gained by the students in the programs of this institution. It's presumed that they'll either get it on the side, they've gotten it previously, or they'll pick it up as time goes by. But specifically with regard to ontology and epistemology, it's been my experience that a basic understanding of those helps me to appreciate the evolution of ideas throughout human history, from positivism to critical theory to postmodernism, which you really can't be as conversant about the field if you don't understand those basics. And then ethics, to be engaged in a reflective practice, assumes that a practitioner has her ethical paradigm, is aware of what that is, because if she's not going to be able to conduct an effective and practical reflection on her practice.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not necessarily saying that the institution is responsible for that instruction, but that the institution ought to bring it to the students' awareness.
Right.
You just gave me another book idea, for God's sake. But that's a really, really.
Of course, there's so many places where it should be, and it could be, and there's also the issue of convincing our colleagues, quite frankly, and balance, but absolutely. So
I'm thinking a lot these days about how to distill the biggest barrier between philosophy and enlightenment of the masses, of us as masses, is that philosophy is too damn obscure.
Mhm.
And that translation has got to be, so, I've been very interested in books on philosophy for dummies, and I'm thinking about maybe philosophy for conflict dummies, or something in which we can acknowledge ignorance, but at the same time not expect somebody, just because they take advanced seminars in philosophy, they're not going to get what we're trying to do here. This is more the Socratic question of asking the right questions.
But if
Like Socrates asks questions, and then you have to think about ontology, or hermeneutics asks a question, and then you have to think about the nature of the words that people are using in a situation, and maybe we can create some guidelines to that.
I want to suggest that the way to do it, if there wasn't like a seminar or something everyone had, we do that plus the opposite. The opposite is describe the conflict. Okay, give me a mapping.
Yeah.
By the way, conflict mapping is for dummies. So what is the meaning of that word violence? What is the meaning of that word hatred to you? What is the meaning of the word Palestinian?
Right.
Or human rights? Or abuse, human rights abuse? Is it universal? Is that a perceptual issue of the victim? Or is it universal? So if we reflect on the meaning of those words in the conflict mapping, the philosophy comes out.
Yeah.
It comes out more, as it were, naturally in a certain sense. So I would love to see it both ways, kind of, study philosophy, as you're saying, plus engage in a philosophical quest by asking, what are the conditions that make sense and calling that a human rights abuse? Why is that a human rights abuse? What are those preconditions? And that makes it grounded and very much, very rich.
From a brain point of view, I mean, that's why in my TED Talk and the future writing, what I'm focusing on is the simple question, what do you want? In other words, when you say to somebody, we know, why does the conflict in Iraq upset you? So if you're a soldier, you have one reaction. If you're American, why does it upset you? How do you react to the word guns? So everybody reacts from the amygdala. Some people love them. That's their source of life. Some people hate them. Say it's a source of death. I mean, it's really passionate, right? So what do you want to do? So when you say, what do you want to do? The brain goes into the neocortex and has to think about the future, about constructing reality. Immediately, it puts a damper on the amygdala. It keeps emotions and vision in proper balance. So I think that, and this is what Socrates was trying to do to every person he met. He asks questions.
Right.
What do you mean by that word? What do you want to do? What do you think the state should look like? And that question itself is the civilizing question. It's like, okay, well, we can't be what we used to be. What do you want to be? Then you get everybody involved. And that's where democratic ideas, the democratic investment in the human mind comes from, but not a wild mind that's just supporting the craziest political party that gets you the most angry. That's not really democracy. That's a kind of organized insanity. Democracy was really about stimulating the mind to conceptualize the good society. And what are my interests? What are your interests? Those are all
You're linking it to the polis.
Yeah, but really, there's religious models of this, the secular.
Exactly.
It's not just an Athenian model.
Yeah.
This really is quite universal. Confucius was asking this question: what is the ideal society? It's quite universal.
Absolutely.
And from a biological point of view, all of these questions stimulate the neocortex, which is our nonviolent side of our brains. And I think that we should think about how we can do that in our field that would enrich us and also maybe bring us to greater consensus on some
That's another
professional
area
standards.
we should study is the neurophysiology.
Yeah.
Which we don't. Our field is mostly silent.
I know, it's a very exciting time because the
It's very exciting.
the physiology and the neurology and the philosophy are actually coalescing in very nice ways.
Yeah.
There's a lot of good stuff going on in nonviolence. So we should
We
wrap
should-
up.
Anything else? Anything else? Okay. So.
We'll
thank you
continue
very
next
much.
year.
We would love to do this next year, and thank you for doing this. This
Thank
was
you.
totally fun. And Michelle comes just in time, kind of intuitively, magically. So these are great ideas, and I hope we at least continue conversation and maybe some. I'm always motivated when I hear other people around here.
So
It's very
thanks for
exciting.
coming, and also, bring a wise friend.
Yeah,
Bring someone else next time.
and yeah,
That would be good.
we'll do something
How
next
about the
year.
dumb friend that really is creating a lot of damage that needs help?
Well, then we'll figure out what to do with them, but we need a community of people to think together.
Yeah.
No, man,
That's
this
what's
is
ideal.
a special pleasure, and I regret not coming before.
Well,
They're on YouTube, by the way.
Yeah.
We'll
right,
send you
you-
links.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
thank you very much. I need